We'll give Mr. Meeks another 2 minutes, but I thought I'd share with you this thing that happened last night to me. It was fascinating. I was walking from across the Senate side and through the park there, and this guy comes up to me and he pulls a gun on me, and he says, "Give me your money." And I said, "I'm a member of the United States Congress. You can't rob us right here." He says, "You're a congressman. Give me my money." Okay.
One more minute.
One more minute. With permission from my Democratic colleagues, we'll start the hearing, and then when Mr. Meeks arrives, he will be given his chance for an opening statement. Do any of you have 1 minute opening statements to make? Okay, we will then proceed with the 1 minute opening statements after I make the opening statement. Good afternoon. I call this hearing to order. Today, we return our attention to the political situation in Turkey. Oh, could have waited 1 more minute. And then, there you go. Okay. Today we return our attention to the political situation in Turkey. Those of you who have followed the work of this subcommittee will note that this is a topic we have dedicated significant time towards in the past. This has not been motivated by malice, however, but a sincere desire to keep the United States-Turkish relationship rooted firmly in shared interests and shared values. As we meet now, voting is already underway in a referendum to rewrite the Turkish constitution. Voting is expected to be completed later this month on April 16th. If adopted, the new amendments to the constitution, to the Turkish constitution, will cement in law much of the power President Erdogan has already seized for himself. The new constitution would see Turkey convert into a presidential system, combining the head of state, head of government, and head of the ruling party all into a single powerful office. Once leading position of prime minister, once all that is done, the prime minister's position will be eliminated. The president will be able to select his own vice presidents and his own cabinet. The power of the legislature to check executive branch would be drastically reduced. After reviewing the proposed changes in the Council of Europe's Venice Commission, an advisory body of constitutional experts concluded that these amendments that are being voted on by the Turkish people, these amendments, and I say amendments, represent a dangerous step backwards, end of quote, and that these changes put Turkey on a path towards, and I quote, an authoritarian, end of quote, regime. This referendum is the latest in a long list of actions taken by the Turkish government under Erdogan. And under Erdogan, we've seen basically the civil society closed space for them, silencing the media, sidelines, we've seen sidelining of the judiciary, and a neutering of the military, of course. I recognize the traumatic and unsettling nature of the failed July coup, But Erdogan started down this path towards authoritarianism long before that coup. President Erdogan's desire to maintain power at any cost is not good for the people of Turkey. It's not healthy for Turkey's democracy, obviously. It is not in the interest of Turkey, and Erdogan, if nothing else, is spoiling Turkey's relationship with Europe and the United States, and alarmingly has opened up Turkey to a greater risk of attack by radical violent Islamicists. Lastly, while thousands of Turks have been unjustly fired and arrested, forced abroad, I need to highlight one particular case, and that is Reverend Andrew Brunson, an American citizen who has been needlessly detained in Turkey since last year. In February, I, along with 75 other members of Congress, signed a letter to President Erdogan requesting his release. Sadly, Mr. Brunson remains in jail, and this case continues to be an impediment to our relationship. I want to thank all of our members for coming today. I don't have many on my side of the aisle. I thank my Democratic colleagues for joining us today. I'm going to yield to Mr. Meeks for his opening statement, and then each member will be granted 1 minute for an opening statement, and then we'll hear from the witnesses. Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Chairman Rohrabacher, and for the opportunity to talk about the U.S.-Turkish relationship. We see we've got a full audience today, and the timing is interesting as it is less than 2 weeks before the important constitutional referendum. The timing is also unfortunate because I know how congressional hearings resonate in Turkey and are sometimes used to misrepresent the feelings of Congress. I do hope that this hearing helps foster better relations between our two countries and does not fuel anti-American sentiment in Turkey with either side. Nevertheless, as someone who has visited Turkey several times and loved Turkey and particularly the Turkish people, it pains me to watch what is transpiring in that beautiful country. The attempted coup that we discussed in our last hearing on Turkey was a traumatic shock to the system. In the aftermath, President Erdogan sought to rid the government agencies of coup plotters, Gulenists, and more. And what he has actually done is overreached, and he is not respecting due process or the basic tenets of democracy in what appears and is a power grab. And I've already heard from several members of my community in my constituency and folks from Queens very concerned about the democracy and how it will continue in Turkey, and whether or not those individuals who have been jailed and not given due process, what will happen to them, and how long will this continue? This is of tremendous concern to me. Now comes another test, the upcoming referendum that attempts to turn the Turkish government into what is being called a presidential system. The question is, why now? Is there a special need to formalize President Erdogan's power in light of threats that are real or imagined? Regardless of the outcome of the referendum, which seems to would be hardly fair and free, I do not see how Turkish democracy wins. In either scenario, the economy will continue to suffer, the brightest will continue to leave Turkey, and the space for a liberal Turkey will become even smaller. And during this difficult time, our Secretary of State paid a visit without mentioning anything of the troubles I and our chairman has outlined. It is difficult to speak honestly with allies in trouble. It is easier to skip that conversation and hide behind the rhetoric of the war against ISIS. I hope that Mr. Michael Flynn's role, who was a paid foreign agent in the Trump administration, has nothing to do with the egregious silence on the state of democracy in Turkey. As I follow my former mayor's recent interest in Turkey, I hope that Mr. Giuliani's work to protect Turkish bankers does not seep into the Trump administration's position, for far too much is at stake. We are discussing a NATO ally, and it is best for the United States that Turkey remain in NATO. because a Turkey without that anchor is left in a difficult region and an understatement, without support, without someone to work with them in the difficult nature of democracy. Both NATO and the U.S. have a tremendous opportunity and responsibility with our ally Turkey in this regard. And despite the crackdown on freedom of speech in the Turkish press, despite the firing and jailing of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of public servants, and despite the fact that this election will likely not be free and fair, people still in Turkey are in the streets demonstrating. The Turkish people are resisting and persisting in the face of great odds. This is the hope that I want to keep alive. The Turkish people care about their democracy. All you have to do is ask them. And that is why they are in NATO. And that is why I am here today to listen and to learn from our witnesses. And I'd like to thank Ms. Ducolo for being here with us again. I know she was up on the Hill in the State Department for a while, and I just happy to see you back here on the Hill. And I yield back.
All right, Mr. Sherman.
Couple
For
notes.
1 minute.
A couple notes on history. Early in the 20th century, the Armenian people were subject to a genocide that will be recognized here in this building today. And Turkey would be a better ally of the United States if we had a government that came to terms with its history rather than one that tried to engage in genocide denial. Early in the 21st century, Erdogan welcomed, or at least turned a blind eye, to ISIS fighters going across Turkey, using Turkey as a place for R&R and recuperation and medical training, in part because they were fighting against Assad. Now he faces a blowback from the same ISIS fighters that he once welcomed or at least gave safe passage to. Erdogan is not a democratic leader. He is, as others have pointed out, moving Turkey toward authoritarianism. That being said, there is an effort to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. I, for one, would want to make sure that any such action did not include the AKP, which may have some philosophical roots with the Brotherhood, but is not, at least at this stage, a terrorist organization. I yield back.
Mr. Series.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's hearing to evaluate the challenges facing democracy in Turkey, and thank you to our panelists who've been here today. Well, Turkey has been a strategic partner of the U.S. and a key NATO ally in a volatile region. I am deeply troubled by the actions of President Erdogan and his government following last year's coup and the implications these actions have on the future of democracy in Turkey. Amid the atmosphere of distrust, Turkey's government has detained or dismissed tens of thousands of personnel within its military, judiciary, and civil service, and the education system, as well as taken over or closed various businesses, schools, and media outlets. It is unclear how long this type of purges will last, but it is imperative that the U.S. and our European partners continue to press Turkey to follow the rule of law. The emerging relationship between Erdogan and Putin also contributes to not only the uncertain future of U.S.-Turkey relations, but to the future of democracy in Turkey as well. In less than 2 weeks, we will have a clearer picture of the trajectory of democracy in Turkey when Erdogan's proposed constitutional changes to increasingly consolidate his power will be put to a vote. Hopefully, the referendum will be held freely and fairly without undue influence. The Turkish government should take the opportunity during these unstable times to unite Turkey and not to intensify division and mistrust. I look forward to hearing from our esteemed panel of witnesses on the views of the current events and the impact on the U.S.-Turkey relationship, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Chairman Rohrabacher. And Ranking Member Meeks, for calling this important and timely hearing. Turkey remains a key ally in the fight against ISIS, yet has had considerable challenges of its own in recent years. President Erdogan has consolidated power in recent years, culminating with the planned referendum this month that would give him sweeping authority and jeopardize the Turkish democratic system moving forward. I'm gravely concerned by Erdogan's government's use of mass arrests of civil servants, critics, journalists, academics, and anyone it perceives as an opponent. The government's use of a state of emergency to carry out a sweeping crackdown against anyone who dissents with its views is counter to democratic values. The Trump administration has thus far shown no willingness to criticize the undemocratic and repressive tendencies of the Erdogan government, a position which I fear will only lead to further bad and destabilizing behavior. Moreover, 100 years after the fact, the Turkish government continues to deny its well-established role in the Armenian genocide and continues to target Armenian, Kurdish, and other minorities within its borders. As we approach the commemoration of the 102nd anniversary of the Armenian genocide, it is my hope that this is the year in which the American president will fully recognize the atrocities perpetrated against the Armenian people by the Ottoman Empire beginning in 1915. The Armenian people deserve full recognition and acceptance of their suffering. I look forward to today's testimony and to having an opportunity to discuss these issues in more detail, and I thank you and yield back.
Thank you, and Ms. Kelly. Right. Well, I'd like to welcome our witnesses today. And I would ask if the witnesses could keep it down to 5 minutes, and please submit anything more than that for the record, and that will be part of the record of this hearing. I will introduce the witnesses, and then we will proceed down the line. First is David Phillips, as Director of the Program on Peace Building and Rights at Columbia University's Institute for the Study of Human Rights. He is also the author of a recently released book. There it is. I'm a writer. I always wanted to have a book, but I haven't got one yet. But thank you for sharing that with us today and the knowledge that you gained. Your book's entitled An Uncertain Ally, and it's specifically about Turkey. So we appreciate you sharing this expertise with us today, as you did, sharing your talents as a foreign affairs expert and senior advisor at the State Department. We have with us also Hement Urksel. I hope I'm pronouncing this correct. Okay. Ukasel, okay, or something like. Why don't you pronounce it for us? Usel. Okay. He is representative of the People's Democratic Party, or the HDP, in the United States. He has spent his career working in the United States and in Europe to promote conflict resolution between Turks and the Kurdish minority. We appreciate you being with us today and sharing your insights. And Ali Sinar is president of the Turkish Heritage Organization and has a long track record in terms of working on U.S.-Turkey bilateral relations. He has been both a journalist and a businessman and is well-versed on the issues that we're going to be discussing today. And I'm going to ask Naz to pronounce her last name for us again.
Durakolu.
Okay, I'm going to get it. All right. You got it. Well, if anybody can pronounce Rohrabacher correctly, I'm going to give him an award as well. She is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Lab, research lab. She comes to us having recently left the State Department, and we remember having her here on several occasions. She was a senior advisor on Europe and Eurasia topics, and before that she worked on Capitol Hill, including as a minority staff director for this subcommittee. So welcome back, and we appreciate all of our witnesses. And we'd start off with Mr. Phillips, and then just say 5 minutes, and we'll just go right down the line, and at that point, we'll open up for a dialogue between the members and the witnesses. So, Mr. Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to address two falsehoods that define the U.S.-Turkey relationship. The first is that Turkey is a secular democracy. It is neither secular nor is it a democracy. In 1998, Mr. Erdogan read a poem. The mosques are our barracks, the domes are helmets, the minarets are bayonets, the faithful are soldiers. He was convicted to a 10-month prison term for inciting hatred based on religious differences. The other myth is that Turkey is an important member of NATO. Well, that may have been the case, but given the close collusion between Turkey and jihadists, including the Islamic State, beginning in 2013, there's serious cause for concern. NATO is more than a security partnership. It is a coalition of countries with shared values. Because Turkey today, under Erdogan, is Islamist, anti-democratic, and hostile to human rights, if NATO were being established, Turkey simply wouldn't qualify as a member. On the subject of Islamism, when the AKP won a resounding electoral victory in July of 2007, instead of addressing human rights concerns or the Kurdish question, Erdogan introduced legislation to permit the wearing of a hijab in public institutions. Just 2 weeks ago, women were allowed to wear the hijab in the military. There is widespread corruption in Turkey. On December 17th of 2013, Mr. Erdogan was recorded speaking to his son about how to dispose of tens of millions of dollars of assets, including plans to buy luxury apartments on the Bosphorus. There have been 50,000 WikiLeaks recordings of his son-in-law, Berat, colluding with ISIS to sell oil from Syria, the proceeds of which at its peak was generating $3 million a day and was used to support the Islamic State. Serious concerns about freedom of expression and assembly. The 1991 law on the fight against terrorism is used to silence critics. Article 8 of the Anti-Terror Act applies selectively to restrict freedom of expression. Article 301 of the Penal Code makes it a crime to denigrate Turkishness. When Turks gathered in Gezi Park in May of 2013 to protest plans to build a shopping mall in a green space, they were violently dispersed by riot police. Protests spread to 60 cities as a result of police brutality. There was scant media coverage of the events while they were going on. Turkish national television broadcast a documentary about the migration of penguins. Provocateurs were tracked after Gezi, and they were rounded up. The National Intelligence Agency is allowed to gather personal data without court order. By November of 2016, Turkey has more journalists in jail than any country in the world. In fact, a third of all journalists that are jailed come from Turkey. There are about 150 imprisoned. About 160 media outlets have been closed. On the transparency report of Twitter censorship, Turkey ranks high for crackdown on social media. It was reported in the Turkish media that President Erdogan called imprisoned journalists terrorists, child molesters, and murderers. Gag orders have been issued for specific activities, including reporting on the transfer of weapons from Turkey to Islamic State fighters. The editor-in-chief of Cumhuriyet was sentenced to 5 years for reporting weapons transfers to Syria. There's some contestation about Turkey's collusion with ISIS. We've conducted an extensive research report, which I've submitted to the committee for the record. Let's remember that Fethullah Gulen and Tayyip Erdogan were fast friends and partners. Their relationship soured, and Gulen was accused of running a parallel state and of orchestrating the corruption crackdown in 2013. After the coup of July 15, 2016, there was a systematic crackdown that you have referenced. About 140,000 Turks have either been imprisoned or removed from their positions. These include members of the security as well as educators. Turkey has become an outlier in Europe. the European Parliament voted to suspend Turkey's EU membership negotiations on November 24th of this year. When the Justice and Development Party wanted to send ministers to campaign for the referendum in Germany and in the Netherlands, they were not allowed to do so because of security concerns. Erdogan responded to that by calling Chancellor Merkel subject to Nazi measures. He described the Dutch action and Dutch government as Nazi remnants and fascists. Recently, a minister said that they would launch jihad in Europe if they were not allowed to campaign there, and they threatened to release 15,000 refugees a week into Europe if Europe and Turkey continued to head south in their relationship. On minority rights, we'll hear from Mr. Yüksel. Let me just say that there are serious concerns about Greek issues and Armenian issues. I chaired the Turkish-Armenian Reconciliation Commission for 4 years. There was a legal opinion issued indicating that the events could be characterized as genocide. Recently, Turkey has intensified its repression against Armenians. It refused to submit the protocols on normalization for ratification. And on Greek issues, the ecumenical patriarch still suffers great repression.
Thank you very much.
In our discussion, I'll share some recommendations with
All right, thank you. Mr. Yüksel.
The Honorable Chairman Dana Rohrabacher and distinguished member of House of Subcommittee. It's an honor for me to testify today on crucial development in Turkey. I would like to discuss a few major threats to the democracy in Turkey and the rule of law. The constitutional amendments that are proposed by President Erdogan and AKP parties projects an authoritarian system of governance whereby absolute power is held by a single person. Even though the proposed constitutional amendments have not been legally accepted, the amendments have been implemented and practiced under the state's rule of emergency. Let me list several indications for extra-legal and single-person rule in the Kurdish area especially, and against the Kurdish political parties. Since the failed coup attempt, July 2016, 11 HDP deputies have been arrested and jailed, including co-chair Selahattin Demirtas and Figen Yüksekdağ. The freedom of speech that democracy supports and Turkey's constitution guarantees is basic allegation that co-chair Demirtas, for what he has subjected to over 500 years of detention. Between July 2015 and March 2017, 8,930 HDP members were detained, and 2,782 party members who have been imprisoned. 494 HDP offices has been attacked, burned down, vandalized, including HDP headquarters. Rallies were attacked, and law enforcement support for these attacks has been widely documented. Around 10,000 municipality and humanitarian employees of Kurdish origin have been suspended from their positions. The government has also confiscated the monetary assets of the people they removed from their positions. Almost all of the media outlets broadcasting in Kurdish, both local and national levels, were closed. Kurdish journalists are arrested and sent to the prison. Even daycares where Kurdish is spoken have been shut down by the government. In the prison especially, the torture and ill-treatment methods has namely been widely practiced, and there's ongoing hunger strike in the prisons for 50 days in some of the prisons. The number of internally displaced in southern eastern Turkey estimated about 500,000 people, mainly the citizens of origin Kurdish. The humanitarian aid to the IDPs is very limited. All of the local humanitarian NGOs has been shut down. The government Governmental aid to IDPs is also conditioned open to leaving their properties and lands, which will bring a demographical change in the Kurdish populated areas. Many people have already left their areas. The authorities has also imposed extended around-the-clock curfews on 30 towns and neighborhoods, prohibiting any movement without permission for extended period of time, lasting up to several months. This month, a long around-the-clock curfew have prevented civilians to evacuate the towns where the Turkish military conducted the operation. The lack of emergency savers to the sick and wounded ultimately contributed high toll of deaths in these operations. In total, 2,000 people were killed during these operations and under the curfew. The public prosecutors have consistently refused to open investigation on the reported killings. Failure to conduct the investigation, the killings, is clear violation of constitutional and international human rights laws. In Cizre, 189 men, women, children were trapped in the basement of the buildings that were heavily shelled by Turkish security forces. These people did not have any access to water, food, and medical attention. Even though the trapped were calling for attention and help from the international community via phone conversation and videos, they were burned alive by the Turkish security forces. The Kurdish cities which has been attacked by the security forces is Sur, Silvan, Lice, Nusaybin, Dargeçit, Cizre, Silopi, Şırnak, İdil, and Yüksekova. Those towns has been destroyed by the Turkish security forces. The images of the destroyed Kurdish cities resemble Syrian civil wars images, which you have also a copy of the photo of some destructions. On March 10, 2017, the United Nations Human Rights Office published a report detailing massive destruction, killings, and numerous of other serious human rights violations committed by Turkish forces between July 2015 and December 2016 in Turkey. Honorable Chairman and distinguished member of the House Subcommittee, my people in Turkey are going through a full-scale assault which could be viewed as a form of genocide. The Turkish authorities have seen the Kurdish identity as the main enemy. Fighting this enemy, they have been conducting a slow-motion genocide. I urge the United States House of Representatives to address this concern, to launch an investigation on crimes against humanity committed in southeastern Turkey, in the Kurdistan of Turkey, to take action to put further pressure on Turkish authorities to respect democracy, rule of law, and human rights, ensure the freedom of speech with releasing thousands of political prisoners and journalists. I also urge the House of Representatives Committee to act open to mediating peace talks and negotiation in Turkey to achieve peaceful political solution to the Kurdish issue in Turkey, and to encourage Turkish authorities to resume peace talks and mediate peace process and achieve a political solution. With the approaching referendum on the constitutional amendments, Turkish society has become further polarized across different social and ethnic and sectarian groups. What has been quite worrisome is the fact that the ruling AKP party has been arming its own supporters, and state authorities have been encouraging attacks on dissident groups within the country. If the situation in Turkey is not taken seriously, and the democracy and the rule of law...
Thank you very much. Mr. Cesar.
Good afternoon, Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of Subcommittee. It's an honor for me to testify today. I'm sure everyone would agree that 2016 was a particularly challenging year for Turkey and U.S. relations. There are disagreements and tensions over two major security issues: U.S. support of the PYD in Syria and Turkey's request for the extradition of Fethullah Gülen. Understanding Turkey's democracy that is under challenge requires a comprehensive review of its domestic and regional risks. terrorism continues to be Turkey's #1 security concern. Overall, more than 270 people lost their lives in at least 12 major terror attacks by ISIS and PKK in Turkey, making 2016 a year of terror. July 15 coup attempt, which was carried out by a faction with the Turkish armed forces, took a considerable toll on the Turkish nation. According to the Turkish government, coup attempt was organized by Fethullah Gülen and his followers. Majority of Turkish people, including opponents of President Erdogan, believe that Gülen was the organizer of the coup attempt. Gülen's network influence of state institutions in Turkey was a well-known fact. For the first time in its history, Turkey, a country that is all too familiar with the periodic military disruptions, was able to stop a military coup, but it claimed 249 lives and injured over 2,000 people. Turkey had survived an enormous threat and had to make difficult choices in the aftermath of the coup attempt. The emergency rule, which is still in effect, was aimed at taking the necessary measures and eliminating the complex national security risk that is created. Turkey is gearing up for a historical referendum on April 16, when voters will decide whether or not to approve constitutional amendments that will shift Turkey's current parliamentary system to an executive presidency. Upcoming referendum is an attempt by the Turks to start a new chapter, a chapter that doesn't involve any military-imposed constitution. Under the proposed changes to the constitution, the president will be elected directly by the people with more than 50% of the votes, which means that there will be a better representation of the national will. The Turkish parliament will remain involved in the political process and able to investigate the president if needed. Considering the challenges Turkey faces, my understanding is that the proposed changes will set the foundation for a more stable and secure Turkey. Don't we, United States, need a much stronger NATO ally in the region? The Kurdish issue. Since 1980, Turkey has been experiencing a violent conflict with Kurdistan Workers' Party. PKK is classified as a terrorist organization by United States, NATO, and European Union. The fight between the PKK and the Turkish state cost more than 40,000 lives. When looking at the Kurdish issue in Turkey, today it's important to separate Turkey's Kurdish population from the PKK terrorist group. There are concerns about certain HDP members maintaining links to PKK or otherwise supporting the terrorist group, such as in case of some HDP members attending the funerals of PKK terrorists, meeting at their base camp in Kandil, and posing photos. It must be also remembered that despite the base is broadly Kurdish, the HDP is not de facto representative of all Kurds in Turkey. Freedom of expression and the media constitute an important pillar of human rights in Turkey. It's a fundamental freedom guaranteed under the Constitution and other relevant legislation. It's important to note that the post-coup attempt state of emergency has required extraordinary actions in order to ensure the stability and security of Turkey. Those journalists who have been detained or arrested under the state of emergency have been charged with serious crimes, which include spreading propaganda for terrorist organizations such as PKK and FETÖ. Domestic remedies exist for those who believe they have been wrongfully suspected in anti-terrorism investigations. The Inquiry Commission on the State of Emergency Measures addresses the application from citizens who feel they have been wrongfully persecuted. This provides an effective domestic legal remedy to any false accusations. US-Turkey relations more important now than ever. Turkey and Turkish democracy is experiencing an exceptional period of stress due to these security concerns. A weaker, destabilized Turkey will be a disaster not just for citizens of Turkey, but for Europe, NATO, and US. As Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dunford said during an Ankara visit, an expressed willingness to work through these issues, shared perspective will mean stability in the region. US remains the ideal example of such democracy, and it's important now that ever Washington and Ankara maintain and improve their strategic and historic relationship in order to ensure the security of both their countries. I would like to thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and the committee members for giving me the opportunity to be a part of this hearing today.
Thank you very much, and we wanted to make sure that we had somewhat of a balance to this hearing, and that's always important to have at least one point of view that differs. And we want to thank you for coming today and knowing that that is a challenge in today's society to step forward with your testimony. We appreciate it very much. You may proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Rohrabacher, Ranking Member Meeks, and members of the committee. It's an honor to testify you both as a witness and a former staffer on this committee under Congressman Bill Keating. Congressman Bill Keating's commitment to public service and my work with all of you continues to be an inspiration to me. The Turkish referendum on April 16th should not be viewed as a standalone domestic event, rather a critical moment in Turkey's history with wider implications for the transatlantic community and NATO alliance. The vote comes at a time of heightened fear, polarization, and trauma for Turks who have endured one of the deadliest years in their recent history, a failed coup on July 15, and a subsequent purge of institutions across Turkey. This environment colors the constitutional package at the center of the referendum. If passed, Turkey's parliamentary structure would change into a presidential system with few checks and balances. I detail these changes in my written testimony, but would like to emphasize that under the proposed constitution, the new president would exercise almost complete executive control, with the ability to appoint and dismiss all ministers with no legislative buy-in. Further, the proposed amendments weaken instead of strengthen the Turkish judiciary and give the president the power to appoint 2/3 of the country's senior judges. No matter the outcome, Turkey's partners must prepare to engage with the Turkish state that is in a battle for its future. The 4 key areas to watch are transatlantic security, energy cooperation, economic prosperity, and democratic values. Having the largest military in the NATO alliance, Turkey has a profound influence on international security matters. The use of Turkey's Incirlik air base allows for 25% more strikes against ISIS in Syria, and much of the United States' humanitarian aid work there is based out of Turkey. Last week, Secretary Tillerson visited Turkey to discuss the campaign against ISIS in Raqqa. The final assault on Raqqa has stalled over a disagreement on which forces to use. The U.S. would prefer to see Raqqa taken by a coalition of Arab and Kurdish YPG units, collectively known as the Syrian Defense Forces. Because Turkey considers the YPG an extension of the banned PKK, the Turkish government is proposing to use its own military and a mix of local Arab partners to take back Raqqa. Since the SDF has proven to be a reliable force on the ground in Syria, and given no viable alternative, the United States will most likely back the SDF option. However, it appears to be waiting for the outcome of Turkey's referendum before making any announcement. While President Erdogan would have additional control over the Turkish military if the referendum passes, it's unclear how he'll react to this decision. The build-up to the referendum has also instigated worrying diplomatic rows between Europe and Turkey. The tension between these 2 critical partners of the U.S. may result in long-term damage to Turkey's EU prospects and to NATO's common defense community. If emboldened by a victory, President Erdogan may seek to test Europe's limits further and bring Turkey's EU candidacy to a halt. A loss in the referendum, fueled by conspiracies about European intervention, may be just as detrimental. Regardless, NATO allies will need to work to steady relations between all partners. The outcome of the Turkish referendum can also impact regional energy cooperation. The dynamic of Turkey's influence on the Cyprus reunification process and the negotiations' implications on the Eastern Mediterranean's gas reserves is of note. A successful referendum could empower some Turkish nationalists in the MHP who helped usher the package through Parliament in January. Their views on Cyprus and the Turkish military's presence there may spoil a potential agreement. It is not clear if President Erdogan would follow MHP's lead after the referendum. What is clear, however, is that once the referendum is over, Turkey will have more time and attention to focus on Cyprus. If a deal is reached, reconciliation between Turkish and Greek Cypriots can occur, and Mediterranean gas can flow into the European market. The last 2 international considerations surrounding Turkey's referendum are economic prosperity and democratic ideals, which go hand in hand. Turkey experienced growth and economic stability early on under President Erdogan. Recently, the AK Party government's indifference toward democratic institutions, rule of law, and freedom of expression has undercut Turkey's lasting prosperity. It is difficult to foresee how a consolidation of power away from the judiciary and into the executive would enhance the democratic principles needed for an open, trade-based economy. The only way to bring about more certainty in the Turkish economy is if checks and balances are restored and maintained. Turkey has always been strongest when it comes close to the ideal of a liberal democratic society where all voices are tolerated. For this reason, Turkey's partners must address challenges to democratic norms head-on. Only direct U.S. engagement, a true partnership, and conversation about Turkey's commitment to democratic ideals can deter worse behavior, enhance global security, and bring Turkey to the table on critical issues. In order to be taken seriously, the West must also hold true to its own democratic values and principles. If attacks against the press, unethical behavior, or disregard for democratic institutions becomes commonplace, it will be difficult to make the case of their importance in Turkey and other countries. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Meeks, members of this committee, thank you again for your careful attention to U.S.-Turkey relations. I look forward to your questions.
And thank all of you for your testimony today. The chairman myself will start the questions, and then we will proceed with the rest of the members. Let me start. I'll just the contrast between our two central witnesses here was dramatic in terms of the picture that was being painted. Let me just ask Mr. Sinar, you mentioned that freedom of expression in the press in Turkey is something that the Turkish people cherish and over the years have expected to live with, and certain guarantees of that freedom. But yet you did recognize that today there's been a wave of suppression of freedom of speech. There's been a wave of destruction of freedom of the press. But you mentioned you really put that fault on the state of emergency, which is a result of the coup attempt. My question for you, Mr. Sinaran, is what about the newspapers that were closed up and the journalists that were arrested and kicked out of their job long before the coup? We've been hearing reports. This committee has had a number of hearings on Turkey, and I've always tried to be fair, always make sure both sides were presented. But we had testimony in our very first hearing about, and this is long before the coup attempt, so how can you excuse the suppression of freedom of the press and expression, excuse it by saying the coup and blaming that on the military then, when it was happening long before there was a coup? Go right ahead.
Yes. Chairman, that's a great question. I mean, the freedom of press, yes, Turkey has some problems on freedom of press, but the investigations aren't due to their journalistic work, but due to their support and link to terrorist organizations. So when we look at overall, some journalists and reporters are making propaganda of Fethullah Gülen before the coup, and as well as PKK terrorist organization. And also some of the journalists also were sharing intelligence information to the public, which is illegal through the Constitution. And also I would like to highlight as an example, Gülenist newspapers like Zaman. In 2010, there were some cases to the secular groups, and some of the secular journalists were in prison and set up with FETÖ. Most of them were jailed for many years. And that time, right now, the Gülen is complaining about freedom of press, but in 2010 and before, the Gülenist newspapers be quiet and they were supportive of the freedom of press. So it seems like there's a double standard on what kind of freedom of press we are understanding. As I said, and I would like to give an example, 7,000 newspapers and journals.
Mr. Sinar, we'll submit that for the record.
Sure.
And let me just note that someone else's double standard doesn't excuse the current government's suppression before and after the coup of freedom of the press, because someone else had a double standard doesn't mean that's an excuse.
I totally agree, Chairman. I mean, as I said from my at the beginning, there are some problems on freedom of speech. But when we look at overall 7,000 newspapers and journals, 200 TV stations, 1,000 radio stations, I mean, still there is a freedom at some point that Turkey is operating, and journalists are able to criticize President Erdogan and his party. But the reporters or journalists are linked to terrorist organizations. They are faced, to the crime.
Some may well be linked because someone has made that report and claimed a link. But again, back to we've had 4 hearings on this now, and in the original hearings, what became clear is that certain journalists had lost their jobs shortly after they had reported on corruption of President Erdogan's family and appointees, which does not just jive with an excuse that this is that there's not an overall attempt to suppress speech. To your knowledge, were there people who were reporting corruption in the Erdogan government? Were they arrested in the beginning and kicked out of their job?
I mean, my understanding is I'm not well knowledge on this that I can say there was a corruption or not.
Okay,
but
you can't answer that. All right. Well, let's go back to. By the way, just to be fair, Mr. Phillips, you mentioned that women were now being allowed to wear the hijab, and before in a government office, and before they had been permitted. I don't think that's I don't think that's an indication of radical Islam. Letting women make a choice. Now, if they were forced to wear the hijab, and they were forced to do that, that would be a sign that the people had gone overboard and that was radical Islam. But Mr. Phillips, do you have data that suggests that President Erdogan and his regime has actually, you mentioned the selling of Syrian oil, is this, are you trying to suggest to us today, and please say it outright, and if you can, that under Erdogan, the Turkish government has been providing the resources to terrorist organizations that have been murdering people throughout the Middle East?
Yes, that's precisely what I'm saying. There are 57,000 emails that have been released linking the Erdogan family directly to the sale of ISIS-controlled oil.
And that money went to do what?
That money, which totaled at its peak $3 million a day, went to ISIS to support its caliphate operations, which is used to kill people and to target Westerners.
And do you think that Mr. Sinar's observations, his right to his opinion, but do you think that the fact that you just stated, meaning money that is being siphoned off by the very top of the government and going to terrorists, do you think that had anything to do with the Erdogan's decision to suppress certain news outlets and to make sure that the press was notified that there would be a price to pay if certain criticism was heard?
Any journalist in Turkey who reports on corruption linking the family to ISIS activities is assured of losing their job and going to jail. We saw that in the case of the Cumhuriyet editor-in-chief and their foreign affairs editor, both of whom received more than 5-year sentences for reporting on the National Intelligence Agency's transfer of weapons to Islamic State fighters across the jihadi highway from Sanliurfa to Raqqa, which was a well-known fact, extensively documented.
Well, I will move on to Mr. Meeks, but let me just thank the witnesses. I think I may have a second round, but better get my colleagues their first round.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start with Mr. Rohrabacher. Foreign policy is very difficult, and Turkey's in a very difficult part of the world. And I'm trying to figure out with interrelationships with other governments and et cetera, how we can make sure that the best interests of the United States and actually the best interests of others, whether it's those in NATO and EU, how we figure this thing out. I am really concerned about, because I think your testimony was absolutely correct, that if I'm to stand true to myself, I can't ignore human rights violations and individuals being penalized and put in prison without due process or anything of that nature. But I can't advocate for Turkey to be removed from NATO or anything of that nature because they are a vital ally, especially in that region. So, in your opinion, is there any low-hanging fruit in a U.S.-Turkey cooperation in the political, security, or economic fronts? Something that we can do, you know, because Syria is right there, and we'll talk about Syria and talk about, I'll ask my second question. Let me just ask that first.
Thank you for your question. I think your question actually hits at the complexity of the relationship. You're absolutely right. There are definitely serious domestic concerns within Turkey. However, there is reason for the United States and for NATO in particular, which Turkey is an ally, to be cooperating at all times. Just, you know, part of it is the geographic location of Turkey itself. In terms of your question about low-hanging fruit, before I mention that, I would just say President Erdogan has demonstrated that he appreciates continual contact with other leaders. And sometimes I think in the structure that Turkey kind of represents at this point, the message that we might be sending as the United States over to Turkey may not be making its way up. So direct communication is key, even though it might be uncomfortable at times. In terms of low-hanging fruit, I alluded to this in my testimony, but what seems to kind of be at the forefront of our relationship with Turkey at the moment is what's going to happen with the Raqqa campaign in Syria. And the United States is moving in a direction to work with the Syrian Defense Forces, which does include YPG elements, which Turkey is highly uncomfortable with. I think some communication there, more regular contact. Secretary Tillerson was just in Turkey to be able to discuss this. However, without an end game or an end point in Syria on our side, it's difficult to imagine what's going to end up happening with Raqqa, with the forces the United States may choose to use there. So it's difficult to explain to a NATO ally like Turkey that we're going to go ahead with this option. However, we don't necessarily know what's going to come of it, and you obviously have serious concerns. So I think closer communication is definitely key, and of course, economic cooperation. This is something that the Turks raise often, I know, here in Congress as well. That could also be helpful. But continually raising these issues of Turkey's domestic politics and the people that are being persecuted unnecessarily, that's key too. That can't be ignored.
So we've got to have those face-to-face, honest dialogue with our allies.
Absolutely.
When we think they're wrong and when we think they're right. Now, you mentioned Syria. You know, there's the chemical weapons that were released yesterday. That's concerning to me. This is complicated stuff, and I don't think that the United States can do. I didn't think that under President Obama, and I know that you worked in during the Obama administration. I don't think that he could have done anything as the United States by himself or in this country. Nor do I think that Donald Trump can. So the question then becomes the relationships that in the region. So I believe it was Turkey that shot down a Russian jet some time ago, and so what's the relationship now between Turkey and Russia and Iran and the whole Syria thing? All of that's intertwined. How does that work?
That's a really interesting question, and one that I know Turkey watchers are continually examining, particularly the relationship between Turkey and Russia. The incident you mentioned happened in November 2015, where the Russian warplane was shot down when it impeded Turkish airspace, and it led to a break in relations between Turkey and Russia, and very heated talks. Sanctions actually came to play as well. Since then, I know that President Erdogan, around June 2016, extended an olive branch. They tried to make things better. to be quite frank, the energy situation in Turkey demands that they do have a sort of cooperation, as well as the tourism industry. There are a lot of Russian tourists that go to Turkey. So I know that Russia and Turkey are working on that relationship. They've had 4 high-level meetings, most recently earlier in March as well. And that's what we were talking about earlier. Russians are offering them more economic cooperation. There are discussions about Syria. However, when you look on the ground in Syria, suddenly there's a very different picture where Russians are obviously not cooperating with the Turks. So I don't know how long that relationship between Turkey and Russia will last.
Could I add to that, please? Right. I'm out of time.
Council established something called a membership compliance review. There are very strict criteria for getting into NATO. There's no process for kicking anybody out. Annually, each member of NATO should be subject to a review of their democracy and human rights practices. And if they receive a failing score for 2 years in a row, then their membership should be suspended. This wouldn't only affect countries like Turkey, but also Hungary would also be under review. And on the subject of Incirlik that we've heard so much about, yes, Incirlik is an important forward air base, but there are other options. Turkey always holds Incirlik use over our heads. There are bases in Jordan, in Kuwait, in Iraqi Kurdistan. There are British bases in Cyprus. So we can diversify our combat air operations without losing our capacity in the fight against ISIS.
Thank you. I'm out of time.
Thank you very much. Mr. Series.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I always think that Turkey has this attitude. If we support an Armenian resolution, and I remember when we had the resolution here in Congress, the pressure that was borne, some of the people that supported it, you would think you were going to go to jail. If you support arming the Kurdish fighters that are fighting ISIS, there's going to be dire consequences. And if you don't return Golan, they're going to make the U.S. disappear. I really think that, Mr. Sonar, when you talk about jailing or purging 1/3 of the journalists in the country, it's a little strong. I mean, this reminds me of my country when I was a boy, when the communists took over. This is how they started. So, to me, I mean, this is somebody grabbing for power. And you have this effort where they took over 600 businesses. I mean, what did the businesses have with these generals? To me, it looks like somebody went out there and tried to get some of the better businesses for some of the family members or themselves. So there's just a couple of things here that do not jive, in my point of view. And as far as NATO is concerned, I would hate to depend on Turkey in a crunch, the way they've been moving the last few years. And Mr. Phillips, my question to you is, if this resolution, if this amendment to the Constitution does not pass, where do you, which I doubt is not going to pass from what I'm hearing, where do you see Turkey going?
12 credible public opinion polls that have been taken about the referendum. 8 of them say that the no campaign is going to win. If, in fact, the votes are stolen, or there's an international opinion that the conditions for the referendum were not free and fair, this is going to fuel divisions in Turkey, and we could see social cohesion fall apart and violence become widespread. That's why it's important for international monitors to be on the ground, to verify the voting conditions. We also have to recognize that if this referendum is approved one way or another, Turkey's aspirations of joining the EU are over. It will not be a European country. It will be increasingly inward-looking. And as Turkey becomes inward-looking, it will be less reliable to the United States. Now, we always talk about Turkey's role fighting the Islamic State. Now, I think that this is a misnomer. We need to recognize that Turkey hasn't fought the United States, the Islamic State. It has abetted the Islamic State with money, with weapons, with health care, all of which is well documented. And we need to see things as they are, not as we wish them to be or how they used to be.
Mr. Sanar, where do you see Turkey going if this fails?
So, Congressman, first of all, for the human rights, I would like to give you some examples before I jump to where Turkey is going. And also, we need to respect to Turkish people. There is a government that democratically elected, and referendum is coming up, including all opposition parties right now. The election is going to be crystal clear, and everybody needs to respect the election. Regarding the human rights...
So you're comfortable that this is going to be an honest election?
Yes.
There's not going to be any interference by the Erdogan government?
Correct. And last election, November election, Congressman, all opposition parties also agreed that it was a non-corrupted elections. Regarding the human rights, as I submit to the...
No Russian interference?
Excuse me?
No Russian interference in the election?
Hopefully not. When we talk about human rights and freedom of press, as an example, before the coup, July 13th, one of the Gülen journalists said, busted in bed and hung by down. Or another one, you just wait and see what's to come. And another one, good times are just around the corner. How I wish I were a colonel today and not professor, then I would have much more to contribute to this process.
What am I looking at here?
So these are the journalists of Gülen.
Oh.
So they were promoting the coup.
All right.
And Congressman, I just want to show you...
The gentleman, unfortunately, votes have just been called. Could you please put those in for the record of this hearing?
Sure.
We will submit that. We have about 15 minutes at the most, so we have 10 minutes. I would ask my colleagues to have about 3 minutes each for their questions. We try to get you in. Mr. Keating? Actually, Mr. Cicilline was here first. Well, okay, Mr. Keating, go right ahead. Quick, eat up the time.
With being too gentlemanly, I think that Mr. Aklu named 4 pillars, if you will, of that we should be focused on. My discussions with representatives of Turkey since I've been in Congress have really come back to economic cooperation. There was a great deal of interest when there was interest in the TTIP agreement. And every discussion I had virtually centered on that. Now, with the failure of our trade agreements, I do hope there's a chance for even a bilateral EU and U.S. agreement. How important would that be, really, to find some inducement for Turkey to have more open discussions with the West and with the U.S.?
Thank you, Congressman. That's hugely important. You're 100% right, and I know you were very active on that issue at the time. I think at the time, Turkey was nervous about the TTIP agreements and being left out of the economic prosperity that might take place, but there was a parallel conversation with Turkey about how they can potentially benefit, and they were engaged, and the United States was engaged in that conversation as well. So as long as that carrot is there, that's very important to bring Turkey to the table, because I am of the opinion, and with all due respect to all the viewpoints represented here who are very important, but they need to continually be more exposed to our ideals as well as our thinking, and to be able to understand that we do want what's in the best interest of Turkey, including more freedoms for their people there.
Is there any way to ascertain what the feelings of the Turkish people, what really was about the coup itself? We heard so much about the coup, but what about people, the general population? Is there any way to get a sense of how they perceive that?
There have been several polls, and I have to, unfortunately, there's not a very positive picture to paint there. A lot of the polls, they do overwhelmingly believe that this was a Gulen orchestrated coup. And many, and unfortunately I don't have the exact figure with me, but many also believe that either the Central Intelligence Agency or the United States was behind this, which is wrong across the board, but that is a prevailing view, unfortunately, in Turkey.
Great. I'll yield because of the roll call. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Rakalu, I appreciated your testimony other than that reference to how Mr. Keating inspired you. But thank you to the witnesses. What I'm interested to know is, with respect to the treatment of journalists and academics and opposition leaders, Mr. Phillips, would you just tell us what your assessment is with respect to the imprisonment of journalists and the conditions in which they're being imprisoned, and whether, in fact, they are primarily people who have disclosed classified documents and the like, and what's the real situation in Turkey right now with respect to opposition leaders and journalists?
Freedom House says that there is no press freedom. According to Freedom House, Turkey does not have press freedom. Turkey uses legislation as the basis for arresting journalists. The idea that almost 2,000 journalists would have been arrested because they insulted the president, to me, represents a crackdown on freedom of expression. Using items in the Penal Code and the Anti-Terror Act to suppress debate is also a violation of freedom of expression. So we should just deal with the facts. Right now, more journalists are in jail in Turkey than in any other country in the world, more than China, more than Iran. A third of the journalists in the world who are in jail in Turkey. What conditions they are experiencing there, I can't say. But I do know that the rule of law in Turkey is an instrument to suppress oppositionists.
Thank you. And the other question I have is, you did a significant amount of research about the role of Turkey both in assisting with logistics and transportation support and training of ISIS fighters. Could you speak a little bit to that? And then my last question to other members of the panel is, what is the likelihood that in the context of the continued state of emergency, that a referendum can be held which is free and fair and something upon which the international community and the Turkish people can rely?
So we were not able to use primary sources for our research because we weren't on the ground in Syria. We used credible secondary sources. We referred to Vice President Joe Biden's remark at Harvard, where he said that Turkey was the primary sponsor of ISIS. And then through our research teams in Turkey, looking at Turkish language reporting in Europe and in North America, we came up with scores of credible reports that Turkey was involved in providing weapons, financing, logistics, serving wounded warriors in hospitals in Turkey. So there is ample evidence. Meanwhile, we hear constant protests from President Erdogan that Turkey is being misrepresented. I think the protests should be coming from the United States, that Turkey, a NATO ally, is aiding and abetting a terrorist organization.
Thank you, and Ms. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Miss, I hope I pronounced right, Durakalu? Okay. I'm concerned with after the constitutional referendum, I'm concerned with the weakening of the independent branches of government, because there are a few checks and balances in place now, and also how will the minority populations be affected, as well as will there be any effect on military independence?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Yes, that is a concern. It's also a concern expressed by the Venice Commission that looked at the package of amendments. In terms of the judiciary, I think that some of the greatest changes in the constitutional package take place there. As I alluded to in my testimony, about 2/3 of Turkey's senior judges can now be appointed by the president, and further, there's a body that actually deals with both prosecutors and judges in Turkey, and they end up dealing with judiciary issues as well as appointing judges, and the president can appoint a significant amount of those members as well. That all being said, there have been some studies on the referendum and the package package of amendments, and some of them in English, actually. And there is the potential to still abide by checks and balances. It really does come down to the president under this new presidency to be able to maintain that balance. So I know that there are some with the hope that President Erdogan, who will most likely be the president under this new system, be able to do that. But when you look at it on paper, and all those who've analyzed it, they have a rather bleak view of the separation. And for minority issues, I would defer to my colleague from the HDP.
The situation is very hard because of, especially with this situation, they shut down the television, which was transmitting only for cartoons for the children in Kurdish. And after a lot of pressures, they allowed, so even with a lot of translation in Turkish, or should be more than 60% in Turkish. That's how the minorities live right now, that front of an assimilation. And the other minorities numerically are less, and they are under huge pressure. And plus, the Alawites in Turkey are under huge pressure because they see the regime changing more and more an Islamic regime, and without any law like Iran, and they're afraid that they will be the next target.
Thank you.
Congresswoman, I would like to highlight a few things.
Excuse me, but you got your minute because you're here, and we appreciate you giving the other side. But we're going to have to be out of here in a couple minutes. So 1 minute. What do you got?
Sure, Congressman, Chairman, I wish at least we can see a little bit appreciation of Turkey's fight against ISIS. And I'll be submitting some documents that U.S. Pentagon also said that there is no evidence between ISIS and Turkey lost 72 security personnel on the ground, and 1,000 ISIS terrorists neutralized by Turkish army in Syria's operation. And also regarding the human rights, and I would like to ask a question. When we look at some
You've got
HDP members here
Okay.
that are promoting PKK at their meetings.
all right.
Can you imagine a congressman?
You want to put that in the record?
Sure.
Okay.
Can you imagine a congressman attending a ISIS leaders event and promoting the terrorist organization?
Okay.
So this is a big problem for Turkey. It's a national security risk.
All right. Thank you. I'm sorry, we've only got 2 minutes or 3 minutes to go because we're got to go vote. And you have a 1 minute closing statement, Mr.
I'll
Meeks.
say real quickly, number one, I want to thank the witnesses for your testimony. I want to thank the chairman for the diversity of the witnesses that you presented. I think that you've got thoughts from all sides. For me, there's a lot. This is a very difficult period of difficult decisions, a lot to look at. And as I stated in my opening statement, the key to me is the bottom line, the one that I have ultimate belief in is the Turkish people. So I should hope that the Turkish people, that's where I keep my hope in, that I will stand with them. I will try to make sure where I see atrocities, I will speak up and speak out. But I believe that the Turkish people will stand up. And as I've seen the brave ones still on the streets now protesting and doing what they think is necessary, and others who may be on the other side, because ultimately that's what makes the difference, the Turkish people.
Thank you, Mr. Meeks, and I would echo that sentiment. The Turkish people are voting on whether they want to have a tough, strong, centralized power controlling their government, or whether they want to have more of a loose freedom and exchange. Obviously, they would be overlooking, we don't think they should overlook this incredible suppression of the press and of disagreements and dissidents that now is in place in Turkey as compared to the last 15 or 20 years in Turkey's history. Let me note, one of my colleagues said, we don't know if we can rely on Turkish people to back us up. The bottom line, the whole Cold War, the Turkish people were the friends of the United States. We could count on them. They fought in Korea. They were part of the deterrent that prevented the Soviet Union from thinking they could come down and attack all of Europe. The Turkish people are going to the polls right now to decide, will they be friends of the West and the United States? Will they be a friend of the United States? And will they have the government, a a radical-oriented government, an Islamic-oriented government, a terrorist-oriented government in power in Turkey, or will they be friends of the United States and have more of a democratic future? That will be determined. I agree with Mr. Meeks. We're on the side of the people of Turkey. Please, I would hope that they hear our plea, remain our friend. Don't go to the polls and then basically join in this negation of a friendship that has lasted so long and done so much well for the people of the United States and the people of Turkey. With that, I said, thank you very much. We've got to go vote.